So I'm here today to talk about this issue of abortion, obviously a very difficult issue. And I think, if we're honest, I think the majority in our country know we have a problem here. And why do I think that the majority, even silently, are aware we have a problem? Because every year when the abortion statistics get released, we have people who are pro-choice who still come out publicly and tell us, and some not publicly as well, but they would tell us that they think the abortion rate or the number of abortions is far too high. And in response to that, I guess I would say, well, if there's nothing wrong with one abortion, then what can there be? Well, how can there be any problem with over 14,000 of them? The fact that we see 14,000 of them and we're confronted by that reality, I think, is a very, very confronting reality you can't look away from, and I think our conscience is pricked by that fact as a culture. Plato, this is why I have a picture of Plato up here. Plato, the philosopher, once said, one of the penalties for refusing to participate in politics is that you end up being governed by your inferiors. And obviously there's an element of jest in the statement, but I think another way of saying the same thing is this. If we don't engage in the political process, we end up living in a country with bad laws. And currently I think we are in very real danger of ending up with a bad law in regard to abortion. We have a small but very vocal group of people who are agitating for a major change to the abortion law in this country. A change that would result in the introduction of a terribly flawed, in my humble opinion, piece of legislation. What is being proposed, furthermore, has not arisen organically from the New Zealand people or because of some pressing social need. Instead, as with a lot of these issues, what is being proposed is an imposition based on an extreme ideology. And in this case, that extreme ideology would try and suggest that abortion is a human right. Now, I don't have time to debate the flaws in that particular proposition, but I will say this, that even when you talk about people who are pro-choice, the majority of people who would call themselves pro-choice on this issue, the majority would not even support that extreme position, that it's a human right. People often think of it as a necessary evil or something that you have to have in your culture, but it's very rare. It's a very committed ideology which would try and declare that this is a human right. And despite what is currently being claimed by some, this proposed law change is not merely about ratifying the status quo. Ratifying the status quo would simply involve making amendments to existing abortion laws, but that's not what is being proposed. Instead, what the advocates of this policy are actually calling for is the existing laws to be completely struck down and replaced with something new. What is being proposed, I think, is probably the most extreme change to New Zealand's abortion laws in our entire history as a nation. And the result would be outcomes such as the legalisation of abortion on demand or abortion on request, the removal of the right to freedom of conscience for New Zealand medical practitioners, so they would be forced to refer and participate in the process. And it's almost certain we'd end up with legalised late-term abortion in this country. The legislation that was introduced in the state of Victoria in Australia back in 2008 is held up by the people who are advocating for this change in New Zealand as their gold standard for what they would like to see introduced here. In Victoria, that legislation in 2008, because of that legislation, abortion is now, up to birth is now legal. You can have abortion on demand up to 24 weeks in Victoria, and after 24 weeks, it is legal on the grounds of psychological, physical, and social grounds, if approved by two doctors. And initially you think, okay, two doctors, maybe that's a safeguard. But then you realise that those two doctors in law can be the abortionist and the anaesthetist at the abortion. Now, some Melbourne hospitals have seen a dramatic rise in late-term abortions. One, the Royal Melbourne Hospital, saw a 600% increase in late-term abortions after this legislation, and some truly horrific incidents associated with these. I don't know if you can see this particular article, or the part of the article that I've highlighted, about one case where a trainee was deeply traumatised when she was told to drop, and I'm quoting here, a living fetus in a bucket of formaldehyde. In Melbourne, gender-selective abortion is legal. In fact, a specific amendment was introduced to try and ensure that would be illegal in Melbourne, and it was struck down as the law was being passed. And there are currently at least two medical practitioners who are under investigation and facing the very real possibility of losing their medical licences simply because they refused to refer patients for abortions based on gender selective grounds. So the patients came to them and said, we're having boys, we don't want boys, we want girls. So we want to abort this unborn human being because it is not a boy, it's a girl. And these two doctors said, I'm not going to refer you for that. I find that proposition offensive. And they are now being investigated and face the very real possibility of a loss of medical licence because of that. Now obviously this sort of stuff here doesn't sell very well with the New Zealand public. So instead we are now hearing a lot of bogus claims being made about why we need this law change and why we need to introduce an extreme abortion law in this country. It is being claimed that access to abortion is restricted in New Zealand. Hard to back that claim up when we have one of the highest abortion rates per capita in the world. We had over 14,000 last year. In fact, at one point in recent history it got as high as 18,500. It is being claimed that New Zealand women who currently have abortions are criminals. Quite clearly that's not the case. The law actually sets out a framework in which it is legally permissible. And as of 2 weeks ago, one of the architects of the Green Party policy is now claiming that abortion is currently unsafe in New Zealand law and their new proposed extreme abortion law will make it safe. I think quite clearly most of us can see through such a ridiculous claim. There's nothing new about deceiving the public, though, unfortunately, in order to try and introduce extreme abortion laws and to push through these sort of changes. In his 1979 book, Aborting America, ex-abortionist and co-founder of NARAL, the National Association with the Repeal of Abortion Laws in America, Dr. Bernard Nathanson, who performed thousands of abortions and it was at the forefront of changing the law in America, introducing abortion on demand there. In his book, I should tell you this important fact before I give you this quote. One day one of his colleagues walked into his office with an ultrasound video of an abortion. And this was when ultrasound technology was just coming into more regular use. And they had videoed an abortion taking place on an ultrasound, and Dr. Bernard Nathanson watched that video and never performed another abortion again. That video went on to become the silent scream that some of you may have seen or heard of. Now, in his book, he said this: how many backstreet abortion deaths were we talking about when abortion was illegal? In NARAL, when we spoke of mass statistics, it was always 5,000 to 10,000 deaths a year. I confess that I knew the figures were totally false, but in the morality of our revolution, it was a useful figure, widely accepted, so why go out of our way to correct it with honest statistics? The overriding concern was to get the laws eliminated, and anything within reason that had to be done was permissible. Okay, so there's nothing new. In fact, just to give you an idea of how badly those figures were misrepresented, we are talking about a figure of approximately 160 backstreet abortion deaths, not 5,000, let alone 10. Now, I would suggest that we are currently witnessing is the exact same type of deception going on from those who are trying to push through this extreme abortion law, and for some of the same reasons. Meanwhile, though, the fundamental flaws in the current law and practice of abortion in this country remain completely ignored and unaddressed. The most pressing of all of these issues is the issue of informed consent, which is totally undermined by such things as the current lack of a legal requirement for counselling to be independent of abortion providers. The current lack of a legal requirement to ensure that clients are properly informed of all the known risks associated with abortion, as well as alternatives and support options that are available. The current legal protection of secret abortions carried out on young people under the age of 16 without parental consent or even knowledge. Now, until these issues are actively addressed in any policy that anyone wants to propose, I refuse to accept that what is being put on the table is anything other than an expansion of an already existing and problematic ideology. Now, this afternoon, I have the privilege of being the thorn between two roses. Hilary and Marina, who's going to follow me in just a second and share her story. But these two courageous women, I think, represent the real face of abortion in New Zealand. They represent what I think is a very pure voice, which is free from ideology and free from media talking points. And I think New Zealand needs to hear more from them and more from others like them, because the stories that they have to tell does not in any way favour the narrative and the spin that we are hearing from the activists currently trying to introduce this extreme abortion law in New Zealand. I want to finish by leaving you with 3 quotes about this issue, and then I want to finish with a thought of my own. The first is from feminist writer Germaine Greer from her 1999 book, The Whole Woman. She said this: "If the child is unwanted, whether by her or her partner or her parents, it will be the woman's duty to undergo an invasive procedure and an emotional trauma and so sort the situation out. The crowning insult is that this ordeal is represented to her as some kind of a privilege. Her sad and onerous duty is garbed in the rhetoric of a civil right." The next quote is from US film and television actress Margaret Collin. She says this: "The 1970s women's movement robbed us of our political birthright by changing the feminist platform to support abortion. Abortion hasn't fixed the litany of problems that women were promised would be resolved." And the last is from Benazir Bhutto, former Prime Minister of Pakistan. And she said this: "I dream of a Pakistan, of an Asia, of a world where we can commit our social resources to the development of human life and not to its destruction. That dream is far from the reality we endure." That was a speech she gave in 1994 to the United Nations Development Conference. We all have a right to dream. Let me finish with this one final thought before I hand over to Marina. To begin that radical shift away from an outmoded ideology, I think we need to embrace a vision that is grounded in the human experience, that is evidence-based, and which does not turn a blind eye to the pressing ethical questions which lie at the heart of this abortion issue. Thanks for listening, and thank you, Bob, for having me here this afternoon.